Morning, Dr. Johnson.
Morning. How are you, Zach?
I'm doing well. It's always a good day when you're alive and enjoying another country for a little bit. So,
Good deal, man. Zach, do you have work in Argentina?
no, I work at the Museum of Life and Science in Durham, but I had saved up enough to be able to spend some time with my wife while there was some family problems going on here. But I'll be back Friday mornings when I get back in the States. So,
Okay, okay, gotcha. Good deal. Hope that everything works out well, man.
thank you very much, Dr. Johnson.
Very well. Hey, get everybody to come up on the cameras. We'll go ahead and get ready to get started. I'm sure everybody else will join us as they are able to. Don't want to prolong this any longer than we absolutely have to. On our docket today, we will discuss a little bit the assignments and basically just making sure we're getting through Canvas and have an understanding of how to do that, and then we'll talk a little bit about the chapters, the reading assignment, and give you all a chance to kind of sound off and speak to one another about that, and then I want to introduce you to story mapping. We'll talk a little bit about that. So let me just say good morning to everyone. Thank you all for being here. So I think most of you all who were online with me were able to get the assignments and so forth and get those turned in. Let me see, so you can, here we go. Okay, I think you all have disappeared off my screen, but I'm assuming that you all are still there. Anyway, you should be able to see via screen sharing. Know why it just moved you. Let's see something. I can't do something. Okay, there you guys are. You should be able to see via screen sharing the different assignments that are out there and the different assessments that are there and so forth. Is anyone having any kind of difficulty using Canvas? I have one student who seemed to have challenges, but I don't think that student is online. Karan, if you will, turn on your camera for us, please. Son, whenever we meet in person, so we need to have our cameras on. Same with you, Taylor. I don't think Taylor's audio is on yet. All right, if it wasn't any of you and you don't have any questions about navigating Canvas, we'll go ahead and kind of jump into, our discussion of this week's reading. So this past week, you guys read the opening chapters for People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn. Why don't we start with a very basic question? Who was Howard Zinn? Autumn?
He was, I don't know if the right word is, was he a professor? I know he worked at Spelman College. And so that's something I really know about him. And I'm blanking on what else he did.
He was a historiographer.
Okay. And what's a historiographer, Zoe?
They write about other historians' written pieces, and they analyze those written pieces.
Okay, very good. So everyone, we understand, for those who might not be history majors, that a historiography is a a chronicle of what has been written about a given topic. In other words, the works, the historical works on a given topic. So you might have someone actually in almost any research paper that you would write, you would want to talk about the works that preceded your work as a way of helping people to understand, one, where your research fits in the flow of the larger narrative of what has been written about a topic. So, Autumn, if you were writing on Black women in Tennessee, for example, during the Civil Rights Movement, right, and that was your research topic, then you would want to interrogate those books and articles that touched on the topic that you were going to be writing, so that you would have command of the different arguments that the different historians have made. Does anybody have an idea why we do that? Let me explain very quickly. Go ahead, Zoe.
Oh, it somewhat authorizes your piece when you have different, I don't want to say narratives, but you have different analyses that substantiate your argument or the information that you were putting forth. And it creates a stronger, like, composite historical basis for people to learn from.
Very good. So whenever we write, we have to sort of justify, okay, what it is that we're writing about. In other words, the reader wants to know, why am I reading this, right? And you also want to claim your intellectual space. Okay, so historians, scientists too, they focus on particular areas. And then you want to be able to claim your intellectual space. You're an authority on whatever it is that you have chosen to focus your research on. Okay, and that's hugely important, because what it means is that Zach can now rely on Taylor, or he can rely on Quran to know what they know about their given research. And as it relates to what he's doing, he doesn't have to go and become an expert. For example, with Autumn, who's writing on African-American women in the Civil Rights Movement in Tennessee, he can just refer to Autumn's work and trust that as an expert, she has command of that, right? And then apply that as it's necessary to his research. Okay, but we always write historiographies when we write our research, as Zoe aptly pointed out. It serves as a justification for what we're doing, and helps us to claim our intellectual space. Right. So Howard Zinn was more than just a historian, though, was he not? What else?
He was also
How
a
else would
political
we
science
describe
major
Howard
or
Zinn?
political science professor.
Yes. How else could we describe him?
I mean, I would say that with his background of writing and political science, it gives him a unique view on history, where he can be a little bit more objective than, maybe not a little bit more objective, but he has a different viewpoint on history than a lot of other historians do, where he sees it from more of an economic and political basis that allows him to shine that light on history.
Very good. Very good. So he brings a different perspective, and that's borne out, as Zach pointed out, in part from being a political scientist. What else about Howard Zinn, though? I'll tell you, just to save time, would you consider him someone who was perhaps a scholar activist?
He was a socialist, yes.
I'd say that pretty much makes him a damn activist. Yeah, so that's very good, right? Okay, so he was also someone who was very much involved in the civil rights movement, for example, here in the United States, okay? And many of the other reform movements that were taking place in the 1970s here in the United States. He had been, after the war, he had served as, I believe, a bombardier in World War II, and later became an anti-war activist, okay? All right, so Howard Zinn was someone who wasn't just an academic and not just an intellectual, but someone who was very much, very deeply concerned about the social happenings within the United States, very much concerned about the different forms of oppression that were occurring, and involved in trying to ameliorate those oppressions and circumstances where he found them. So that's Howard Zinn. So it should be no surprise that his book takes a very different turn than most history textbooks, and we had a chance to talk a little bit about that on last week. Let's take a look at this opening chapter for a second. You guys talk to me. What stood out about Zinn's chapter 1?
I think a part, like when I first read the first paragraph, what stood out, um, in my opinion, he was speaking from the point of view from the Taino people. When I feel like most historians would start just by saying Columbus came from Spain, and then he came to the Bahamas and thought it was India, where he saw the indigenous people, and he brought it up like from a different perspective, where they just saw a man come up on the shore and met him to trade with him.
Mm-hmm. In a manner of speaking, then, Autumn, would you think that he's helping to give a voice, perhaps, to people and groups who have been voiceless in terms of the history and writing of U.S. history?
I know somewhere in that chapter he did say that wasn't his initial goal, but I know he wanted to. I don't know why I'm blanking. It's 10 in the morning. But he wanted to. I know he said he wanted to tell it from the perspectives of the victims rather than perspective of the victors. That's what I know.
Mm-hmm. Okay, very good.
To Autumn's point, what she's saying is Howard Zinn chose to repudiate the dominant narrative that is often told when we think about history, which is from the point of, like she said, the victors, and it's very Eurocentric. He decided to take the approach of speaking about the Taino people and the enslaved persons and their stories, which not rejects the way that we have learned about history, but it further contextualizes it.
I think to add on to that, he was very factual in what he would say. So he said that he didn't want to add, like he didn't want to it was too late for us to be able to say like, oh, you know, like these people deserve a voice and stuff. But he was like, but this is how it happened. These people died. This happened. And it's not that he didn't make, I mean, he didn't make Columbus a hero like a lot of American history does, which is I thought was good. But he listed the facts how they were, whether they shined like against the Taino people or with them. Like the massacre when they massacred the English 347, he didn't hold that back. He was like, yes, they killed 347 English people, but then this was the response that was much more brutal. So he gave us the facts on both sides, I think, that gave the Taino people a representation that they've never gotten, but also didn't color them in a fact that they were completely like they didn't do atrocity at once as well, though.
But I even think when noting that the indigenous people committed those atrocities, he also spoke about the motivating factors, which was often out of self-defense, more than not out of self-defense, because they were
Absolutely.
completely being massacred.
Absolutely. And
So,
I'm not giving him, you know,
oh,
factual, but I'm saying he listed the facts
yeah.
how they were.
Ron?
Yeah, I pretty much agree with what everyone's saying. I agree that I liked how I never got the perspective of Columbus, where it wasn't as he's like the great guy that came over to America. So reading the first chapter and realizing like more information that I gained.
Okay. Why do you think it's important? Why did Howard Zinn take this approach? He could have very simply done what other historians have done and probably done well in terms of producing another history text uh, that introduces students to United States history. Why did he take this perspective?
I think his social activism made it to where his perspective is based off of he doesn't want there to be anything erased. He wants it to be laid out how it was and not glorified for a Eurocentric view. He wants not only the people to get a voice that they haven't had, but for us to hear about all of it. He doesn't want the parts that have been erased or just not mentioned at all to not be mentioned.
Mhm. Why
There's
were
also,
aspects of it erased or not mentioned then?
because when we talk about American republicanism or just the national framework, and I do believe he mentioned this, it's often synonymous with the white world because they are the dominant party. So every other history of every other party is inadvertently and just downright, like, I guess, advertently
Intentionally.
erased.
Mhm.
Um, because it's a white world. That's the master narrative.
Mhm. Okay.
I thought it was really interesting how he talks about like what Samuel Eliot Morison did, which was he like lightly mentioned in like one sentence that Columbus's actions led to the like a genocide against the Tainos, but he like it's like almost as if Morrison kind of ran away from it because it was
Mhm.
like he couldn't not say it, but he wanted to what's the right word? Kind of enclose it, like keep it trapped up in all these like accolades and amazing things. And Zen compares it to being like a map maker, and you have to, like, as a historian, you have to pick and choose like what to emphasize and what to not emphasize. But when we're emphasizing things that make a character look good or make them look bad, it's like, and that's very intentional. It's not about teaching people, it's about giving out a certain narrative.
Mhm.
And I think Zen, he was tired of the narrative that he was seeing over and over and over again. And he, as a historian and a political science major, he knew there was more to that. And I think he wanted to give a different perspective.
Okay, very good. Ms. Bias, I'm going to ask you to please turn on your camera. Thank you. All right, so we get some sense of uh, the early European contact with the indigenous people here. Um, what were some of your takeaways from that engagement?
I'd say that the the natives were a lot. I mean, we knew them obviously, or the things that we know from Eurocentric view. We're like, oh, Thanksgiving, they gave us stuff, and they made sure to tell us that. But the way that Columbus described them wasn't just like he didn't describe them as kind, like the way that we're taught. Like, oh, they gave. He described them as naive. Like he started with, oh, they're gonna give us all their stuff. Yeah, let's take it. In his own, like it was quoted from his book or his journal or something. And I thought that was really interesting because I said we were always taught that, like, from a Eurocentric view, that the natives were just nice and we took advantage. But he like started off with that aggressor idea to himself, like, oh, they're naive, we're gonna take everything from them and then do what we need to do.
And Zach, to your point, their presumed naivety, I think that's how you say it, was really just a part of their culture. They were I don't want to say like nice by nature, but they traded without commercial interest. They rarely had intertribunal affairs. And if they did, it was only based upon if there was actually infliction upon one party. And I actually read in a prior piece that usually those would result in maybe one or two casualties, if any, and they just settle it by just being like, okay, we can like work this out. Um, but what that goes to show you is how the different viewpoints of the parties and how we get to understanding the Native Americans through the Eurocentric lens because of his aggressor standpoint and how he viewed these people as naive, or he infantilized them in such a way. And unfortunately, a lot of Americans, they look at them as savages or deserving of what happened to them, or just all these different tropes.
And a point to that is like later in the chapter when he talks about how they slaughtered people because of one stolen silver cup, but they didn't think it was stolen because they didn't have a sense of private property because of their culture. And so that made it to where it was very like he saw them from a European standpoint of war and everything and genocide in this case. But that and that's not taught. But Howardson pointed that out, even quoted his own journal to show it. And I thought that was a really smart move in this case to show his perspective.
Well,
So
that
an
goes to show
interesting
you
couple
how,
of interesting. Oh, go ahead. No.
I'm
Zoe.
sorry, that just goes to show you how these histories are produced because, again, we study it from the Eurocentric standpoint, and they only understood the native people from their westernized or from their white lens.
So there's something I want us to unpack here. You all keep to me, and I keep asking the question, and I don't know that I've gotten the answer that I'm looking for quite yet. Right. And that is, why is that? Why is the construction of this Eurocentric narrative, as you call it, Zoe, why is that necessary? What is what's the reason, the rationale behind that? Right. In other words, that speaks to why Zen wrote the way that he wrote from the perspective that he wrote. So why is it necessary? And not just Zoe, but all of you all. Why is that? You've been all up on it, Zoe. You just haven't really brought it out directly. Go ahead.
it's economically feasible.
It's economically feasible. What does that mean?
When we start to deconstruct white nationalism,
Hmm.
deriving, of course, from Anglo supremacy, it is a byproduct of their Eurocentric view, but it also helps to support it. And thus, it makes it easier for them to go and annex land from different parties that they view as the lesser of themselves. So,
Hold on, slow down just a little bit. Slow down.
okay.
Okay. So you talked about an economic, what? Rationale, an economic justification. I don't want to put words in your mouth. I'm wanting you to speak to me. Okay. All right. So then the narrative written that defines the Tianos, right, as people who were inferior, who had not established a culture that, in point of fact, that had been what the Europeans were accustomed to. They had their own culture, right, that had supported them for millennia. That what? That allows the argument to be made what?
That Europeans or Anglos in general are inherently superior and thus have the right to exploit the colored people, for lack of better words.
So what I'm getting at then, and what now you're getting to more directly, are the justifications then for the exploitation and even elimination right, of certain groups, and the construction of social and economic hierarchies within the United States and how we come to understand them today, right? So if we looked at the fact that, right, in Marisa Baradaran's uh, Black Banks and the racial wealth gap, you know, she contends that that African Americans have about 2% of the wealth of the nation, right? So that's another way of saying that some 98% of it other groups have, right? All right. So if there's a narrative that already speaks to the inferiority of African descended people who came out of society you were already behind, do you follow what I'm saying? All right. So this, in a manner of speaking, helps to support the status quo, but it can be very debilitating for groups who come out of the background of being an African descended person or an indigenous person and so forth, right? All right, so all very fascinating. There's some observations I'd like to make, right? One is that when Columbus came to the Americas, the majority of indigenous people in the Americas were already living in cities. Why do I say that? How many of you all knew that?
Because the narrative for is that they were savages is what we were trying to teach. So we always teach them as in teepees and as nomads instead of as the political people that they were. You know, they had their own government systems, but we're so the Eurocentrics was so adjusted to capitalism and the spreading of monarchies and stuff like that. From a political standpoint, that he sees it as, we kind of don't like to mention that they were a society and their own civilized society, and we try to treat them as savages and as lesser because they didn't have the things we had when really they did.
So if we looked at Charles Mann's 1491, he describes in great detail what the Americas looked like before the arrival of the Europeans. And what we see is that they are coming out of a different context. Many of the indigenous societies, those that were in the islands of the Caribbean, and many of those people had come out of Amazonia. So if I could pull up a map, but if you know where Venezuela is, right, in sort of northeastern South America, south of that, Amazonia, many of the indigenous groups had island hopped from that area to populate the greater Antilles. It is believed, in fact, that the Carib people followed the Arawaks, and the Tianos are part of them, because they were such beautiful people. And that their women were so beautiful. This is one of the stories that is told even today in Venezuela. And the Caribe, though, unlike the Tianos, speaking to sort of cultural diversity, were a people who were more bellicose. And the Europeans described them as cannibals, which was a way to prevent, and they described them as such because the Carib people were known for literally taking their war canoes and paddling out to the European vessels where they, when they tried to weigh anchor, right? Literally to go to war with them before they could even set foot on land, which is something that would be repeated in West Africa later on in the 1500s, after the Europeans had proven that they were not good neighbors. All right, now, this cultural contact is exacerbated also by the idea that these societies, many of them, the Indian societies, were gifting societies. Zach, you mentioned, how do we know about these experiences? Christopher Columbus wrote back to King Ferdinand, and it was in those letters that we read that we learn about the experiences of Columbus and his men and the atrocities that they committed. But what we really see is that they are coming out of entirely different backgrounds. The Europeans came with a very specific motive in mind. And what was that motive?
They wanted to find
find
a quicker
gold?
trade route to India. Oh, sorry. You go ahead. You go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I was going to say Columbus's original was to try to find a quicker route to get to a quicker trade route originally to get to India, which is why you called them Indians, or at least that's what we're taught, correct?
Why did he want to get to India?
He wanted to get their spices and their riches as a trade route because they were a powerful trading partner at the time, but he wanted to get there without having to go through lands that he would not have to go through if he went around the world.
Exactly. Right. So Marco Polo's voyages, you all play that in the swimming pool, Marco Polo. Marco Polo's voyages had shown that there was great wealth to be had through trade, right? Now, the challenge was that the Europeans could not get to India via land. Can anyone explain why? Not as readily.
The nations they had to go through were a lot. The terrain was a big thing because of mountainous and because the nations that they had to go through wouldn't allow them to go through there without I'm guessing taxation, but I'm not sure of the specifics. And they wanted to be more greedy with what they obtained, so they didn't want to have to pay tolls or pay anything to get through.
Excellent. So you had the Islamic states, right? Uh, Go ahead, Zoe.
Didn't the Ottoman Empire control a lot of the territory near the Mediterranean, which really would have been the quickest route? But as you were saying, the Islamic peoples, I'm sorry, they were willing to combat the European forces through blood and fire to have them not have access to those trade routes.
Excellent. Okay. And that's very, very, very important. Internally, the Europeans also had conflict. And as a consequence of that, they were seeking sources of riches that they would be able to use to pay for soldiers, to field armies, and so forth. Okay. All very, very important. And I say this because people don't just today, we travel and you don't give much thought to it. You eat, most of us are fortunate enough to have food security, and we don't think about those kinds of things in the ways that they were thought about at that time, right? So you were really risking your life by taking off and going to sea. So I say that to say you had to have a real justification for wanting to do it. All right. And the Europeans did. So Columbus came on this mission seeking gold, right? In fact, he lied to King Ferdinand about the amount of gold, so you will know that was there. He had learned of some, but the indigenous people did not value it the way that he did. How many of you all have read Candide by Voltaire? Okay, that's an excellent, excellent work, and it is a satire of that period. But he talks about how what was so valuable to the Europeans in gold and silver did not have the same meaning culturally that it did to many of the indigenous groups that they were plundering to get access to those resources, which again speaks to sort of the cultural variance between the Europeans and the indigenous population during that period. Why do you think the Europeans were successful?
Superior technology at the time.
Zoe?
I second. It had something to do with their ships, right?
Okay, very good. That helped a whole lot. The ships.
They also, sorry, I have a cold. They employed like unique tactics. Like if you look at what Cortez did, like he started off by just showing up and be like, hey. And a lot of people thought like they took advantage of what they perceived as like the indigenous people's naivety rather than like differences. Like, for instance, it's theory that Cortez was believed to be an Aztec god who was supposed to return, but he was not. And instead of being like, oh, no, yeah, that's not what I'm here for, he probably ran with it. And so he could use that to gain more access into their culture, so then he could destroy it. And he would also like take people, like he would literally start conflicts between the indigenous people, like they were doing whatever they could to destroy them from the inside out.
Very good. So we have technology, we have tactics. What else played a part in this? Diseases, right?
Smallpox and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That was hugely important. Don't underestimate that. You know, different groups have used that at different times. You know, Toussaint Louverture did use that in Haiti in fighting the Haitian Revolution. It worked in reverse against the French. All very interesting, all very good. You all seem to me to have a good understanding of that period. It's somewhat fascinating to me because there's so much of that history that's left out, that's not taught. How about the African presence in the Americas?
Um, when I was reading the section of it, the thing that I had found interesting that I had never learned, nobody had taught or I had never looked into, was that when the Dutch, he had said when the Dutch had landed in Africa, they were actually, so they landed in the cities of Africa, not in the areas, and they actually made them like they kind of gave away the information about, hey, here are the people we don't like if you want to take them for slaves, and they kind of supported it a little bit because it was killing one of their rivals or something like that. He had mentioned in one of the paragraphs when he was reading about the Dutch originally landing there, and I did not know that. I thought they were just coming and brutalizing and stuff like that originally. I didn't know they had originally landed in cities either.
Right. So there's a lot to take away from what you just said there, Zach. I was really speaking though about, and I'll come back to that, Zach, because I do want to respond to that. But I was really speaking initially about Leo Wanner's work, right? Africa and the Discovery of America, written in the 1920s, right? A Harvard professor, Russian, who wrote about the African presence in America. It said Africans traveled to the Americas prior to Columbus by their own volition. Now, how many of you all have heard of Ivan van Sertima? Van is not as widely known. Van Sertima is a little bit more popular. Now, there were many seafaring nations in West Africa, right? The old empire of Mali, not the current country of Mali, for example, was a seafaring nation. They carried on trade with nations along the Atlantic littoral. There is a current, part of the Sargasso Sea, which flows, I believe, in a counterclockwise direction from West Africa to South America. That current is like a river in the ocean. It is so strong that things that are caught within the current often stay within the current. So in other words, debris, things like that. So imagine even though it's not a perfect circle, a current that flows from Senegal, okay, to the islands of the Caribbean, down to Brazil, and then back to Senegal, kind of like, let's say, in a large oval, which meant it was possible for fishermen from South America or from West Africa to be caught in that current and pull to the coast of the opposite continents. That's literally just by the serendipity or misfortune of being caught in that current. However, there were seafaring nations like Mali. And before Mansa Musa came to power in 1324, as I recall, the Mansa before him had launched 100 ocean-going vessels for exploration and trade. This is from Mali. Now, I say that to say, Columbus, in fact, so you'll know in his letters, ends up writing about, and Columbus had sailed to West Africa in 1487. Can't recall if Howard Zinn talks about that. Did he talk about Columbus's voyages to Africa? He had gone to West Africa in 1487, actually before he sailed to the Americas. Wanner and Van Sertima believed it was there that he learned that there was land to the west, right? You could sail west to go east. He was thinking that was, as Zach pointed out earlier, Asia. Now, coming to what Zach said a moment ago, and thinking about conquest, I told you that the indigenous people were living in cities. It's hard for most of us to even fathom that. Zach mentioned the Dutch, who actually went to one of the early cities that they visited was Benin City, which they said reminded them of Amsterdam in the way that it was laid out, because there were multi-story dwellings and that there were streets that were well laid out. This is in Benin, in West Africa. This is when the Dutch arrived. How many of you see that as sort of your high school, whatever, education in thinking about what Africa was when the Europeans arrived? Multi-story dwellings, cities that are well laid out,
It definitely was not taught.
right? Now, why do I say this? There's a great book called The African Renaissance that was written, man, this is an older book. But in it, it talks about, I'm trying to think of the scholar who wrote this particular article, but he talks about how when we conquer people, the areas that are conquered first are those that are most developed. Okay, so the cities and so forth. Why are those conquered first? Because that's where the intelligentsia are. That's where your science and your advancements and all of that kind of thing is. If you destroyed that, imagine what the United States would look like. Today, so many people live in cities. But what would the United States be without its major cities?
It's similar to the 9/11 bombing and how tactical they were, not like defending that in any way, but how tactical the hijackers were in choosing to bomb the Pentagon and then the Twin Towers, which of course were, with the latter of that being major trading spots conducted in the nation, and the former being really the center of intelligence for the government.
Very good. And on a larger scale, what I'm really pointing at is that, Autumn, if we destroy, right, the major cities, what we're left with most often are people who are living what we would say at that time at a subsistence level, right? Do you know what it means as a subsistence level? Kind of day to day, hand to mouth,
Like
right?
agrarian kind of styles.
Yes, exactly. Okay. And that's what is left, all right? The seat of government is gone. The intellectual institutions, which tend to be where? In our cities, all of that is then destroyed, okay? Which is why we target cities rather than just rural communities and so forth, unless there's some real strategic reason for doing that. All right. That's exactly what took place in the Americas and in Africa. Once those are destroyed, what we are left with is a much lower standing social standing, right, in terms of technology. And it became very easy then later to argue about the lack of that type of development. But if we go back and read what the early slave traders themselves were saying and reporting what they were finding, you will see a much different story. Let's move into chapter 2 and talk about chapter 2. Someone kick us off. Taylor, are you still there? I think I see a shoulder or a knee. Taylor. Someone else kick us off.
I think what I had said, the 1619, the Dutch slavery ship landed in North American soil, bringing the first African American slaves or African slaves, was
It
the
actually
big
wasn't a
start of it.
Dutch ship. That's actually not accurate. We
Oh, okay.
learned later that that was actually a British ship. That was a tall tale that it was a Dutch man of war, right? But
All right.
what is go ahead and tell the story though behind that, because that's actually a fascinating story.
Behind their arrival or behind their gathering of the slaves that he had talked about a little bit.
The 1619, what happens with that? The arrival of the Africans in 1619.
So
Do you know what was what was happening is that Africans were being shipped from Angola to Veracruz in Mexico, right? And the ship was attacked, right? And the Africans who were on that ship were taken off and sailed to Point Comfort, which is Hampton, Virginia today. So you all will know. There's someone in, let me see who this is in the waiting room, to Hampton, Virginia today. All right. And to sail to Hampton, Virginia today. Okay. And then ultimately sold into slavery in out of Jamestown. This is 1619, these Angolans. Now, the ship that they had been taken from, I want to say it was the San Juan Batista that they were on, and it was the White Lion and another ship that attacked them. And they were working as privateers. Privateers are technically like paid for pirates, so you will know, because all they do is sail around and raid and so forth. But they do it for a certain flag. They were doing it for the English. So what happens that's fascinating about this is some of these Angolans end up in Virginia, Autumn, and some of those Angolans, probably related, ended up in Veracruz because the ship, the San Juan Batista, does continue on to Veracruz. All right, so what you have then is an example of how we create the African diaspora, right? This is through a coerced process, of course. But you have family who are in now Point Comfort, Hampton, and family who are in Veracruz. Zen focuses more so on, though, the fact that there were no laws in place for chattel bond slavery at that time, right? What type of servitude was in place at that time?
Indentured
So, you saying
servitude was
something?
in
Yes,
place a
very
lot.
good. Indentured servitude, right? So indentured servitude was very much in place. And what was indentured servitude?
It was kind of like forced labor by, like, he had talked about work gangs before they had arrived by some of the other Europeans, where they would force the Europeans to work the field and stuff like that, and it just wasn't as effective. So they had indentured servitude, which was like it's kind of like you worked just for a specific time period as a servant forcibly, and then would be let off towards, after 15, 20, however many years it was.
Okay. So an indenture was a contract, right? So you'll know an indenture was a contract. And you signed a contract that would allow you to have transportation to the Americas. Then you had to work for a certain number of years. And at the end of that, you were to receive a given amount of land, right? But what was happening is that many of the early Europeans who had colonized as part of the Americas put people to work and worked them quite literally to death. They branded them, they beat them, they tried to control when they had children and did not have children. In many ways, it was similar to what would come later in terms of chattel bond slavery. Many of those people who signed contracts did not, in fact, receive the land that they were supposed to have received. All right. All right. So it was during, though, the 17th century that we see the development and elaboration of laws that would create chattel bond slavery. And that's the major discussion during that period. I think he talks about Anthony Johnson in Virginia, right? But in the early period, and this is fascinating because this isn't really taught, in that early period, indentures often ran off with the Africans if they ran off because of how bad they were both being treated. And he finds a period when he says that changes, and that's in 1676, right, with Bacon's Rebellion. And after that, right, he follows Theodore Allen, who was an author of a book called The Invention of the White Race in 2 volumes. And Allen posits that it was after Bacon's Rebellion that whites who had money came up with the idea of creating whiteness as a unifying um, um, a means of unifying, excuse me, people of European descent, right? Such that poor people who were, whether they were African or the indigenous Indians or whites, would not form themselves into a very powerful class and then overthrow those people who had money and wealth and power. So in a sense, it's what Howard Zinn called class leveling. By creating quote unquote whiteness, it brought all whites, regardless of where they were on the economic hierarchy, into, in a manner of speaking, on the same level over the other groups, right? All right, so a very interesting discussion there. Before that, though, and I touched on this, 1607, what happens? Ms. Bias?
The creation of the Jamestown establishment.
Okay, so Jamestown is established, and we had a chance to talk about that before, and the challenges that came out of trying to settle in that Jamestown area. Okay. What I want you to take away from that is that the establishment of Jamestown foreshadow what would take place across the South, where you would end up with a small aristocracy, if you will, and then a large number of people up under them who labored to support their wealth. Okay. Initially, it was whites. Okay, just like in the Atlantic slave trade, the initial enslaved people were Eastern Europeans, so you will know, and they were enslaved along the Mediterranean and even the islands of the Atlantic. Okay, and then after 1453, that really begins to shift because of contact between the Portuguese who were sailing down the west coast of Africa in the 15th century, and the availability of being able to take Africans into slavery through trade and other means. They initially, so you will know, tried kidnapping them, Zach, but found that the states were too strong to do that. And then they began to trade for them. All right. Chapter 2. What other takeaways do we have for chapter 2?
I thought it was 1610 when Father Sandoval wrote to the church in Europe about if slavery were legal under church law, and the priests returned saying that they had done it for a long time, that it was already doctrine within the church. So I think that really not incentivized, but made it to where the Eurocentric white people were had more of a reason to not feel guilty or not feel bad about the slavery that was occurring, because they were like, oh, the church says it's fine, and we came here to get rid of the Catholic Church and the Protestantism and stuff like that. So the whole reason we left, it's fine, it's okay, and that gave a a backing to their ideals that was more than just themselves needing to survive from the starvation of 1609 to 1610.
Mm-hmm. Thoughts, questions, reactions?
It's very much similar to the Catholic Requerimiento that essentially codified indigenous, the conquest of the indigenous people in the 1450s, if I'm not mistaken.
Mm-hmm.
And said, yes, it was completely okay for the Spaniards to go and do all of this.
From the vantage point of the Catholic Church, right, which was paramount for Catholics, and which did not take into consideration in any thoughtful way the indigenous people. But there was one friar who pushed really hard against that, Bishop Bartholomew de las Casas, right? All right. He wrote a very important book called A History of the Destruction of the Indies, right? And that book tells in great detail about the atrocities that were committed against the indigenous people there. All right. So one of the early reform movements would begin with his work. Others, thoughts, questions, reactions about chapters 1 or 2? Hearing none. I want to turn your attention very briefly to story mapping, because this is where your work will come from. You all will be creating genealogy projects. All right, so if you look at your screen, you should see this is what you should arrive at when you open story maps, which I am going to copy right into, put it right into the chat here. All right, you're going to write your family's history in Google Docs, but then you'll share it. Then we'll use that to create a digital story map. Yeah. Use this one for today's discussion. Okay. So when I open up, you can see I came to some of the different story maps that I have here. I think everybody can see. Okay. So let's open this one, as I said, on the Ellaby Creek watershed. Have you all viewed the film, the videos? Good. Zoe, did you have a chance to? Okay.
Yes, sir.
Okay. I apologize. Don't answer me anymore, Zoe. Stay focused on the road. Okay. Okay, so let's see here. So the first observation I will make, you've had a chance to see the film. Let me start right away and say, are there any questions about what you have seen? I thought the films were pretty much straightforward. And as you will see, like working with most things online, once you kind of get sort of the hang of things and how they're organized, it's pretty straightforward. So here I'm going to go to edit story. You will note that in this, I actually use photographs from the Ellaby Creek watershed, and a watershed is just it's a valley where all of the tributaries lead to a particular larger tributary. The Nile River Valley, for example, could be the Nile River Shed, or same with Amazon or whatever. Well, happens to be a creek in northern Durham called Ellaby Creek. And Ellaby Creek ultimately flows into what is the Neuse River. Now, because it was the watershed, I use photos there of the watershed itself. It's best to use people though. People want to see people. So for your photograph, the large photograph that you have that will serve sort of as the entree into your genealogy, use a family photo, photos of people, because people are taken in by people. It raises their curiosity much more so than just these images of paths and a stream going by and so on and so forth. Okay, so we know that you should have learned that you can manipulate this photo here, right? So if we go to this photo, we can manipulate it. We can change how it is presented. We can change its focus and so forth, okay? So if we go under design, we can change it to a side view here, or we can make it much larger, right? Like so, okay? I chose to keep it small, like so. All right, so under design, we can make changes that will change the whole story map. We can add navigation. All right, so this navigation bar here is established by us turning on that option under design. And that's important because it serves like a table of contents. And the key is that each of these terms or expressions is in heading 1 format. So if you set something to heading 1 format, it will appear in your table of contents. That is very useful for people to get a sense of what's coming and to understand the flow of things, and then to make it very simple for them to get to it. The theme, you can change to make it appropriate for yours, probably black, white, slate. Some of you all might play around with some of the other colors, but they should be appropriate. Obviously, because I'm dealing with a watershed, outdoors, that kind of thing, I use Ridgeline, which has this, what I would call that, what would you all call that? Like a lime green or something like that, pretty much. So that it would fit the outdoor theme. Okay. So that's all found under design. Now, going back to this opening photo, at the center of the photo, you can see here, Sister Bias, there's a gear. If I click that gear, it allows me to change the focus. And that's important because if I'm on a smart device or smartphone, you can put where you want the focus to be on. So that when you have people, for example, you can just drag this little white circle in the middle over, say, the face of an individual, and it'll make sure that that person will appear on the phone as part of the opening screen for your story map. Does that make sense? Okay. All right, so that's what that focus does, and it allows us to see what this looks like. This is actually rotating through multiple photos. Okay. We learned how to insert new information. If we hover over the screen, you will see the plus sign appear. We click that plus, we can add text and all sorts of other information. See, to watch the little plus sign here, Zoe, it will appear. This is all that will be there. When you click it, you can add text. In fact, it'll be there. You could, there's a cursor that will appear also, and you could just start typing technically, or you can click and say text or button or a separator or a table, a map, an image gallery, video, audio, and so forth. Okay. We divide our work following this framework. We'll add photographs of individuals. Okay. And we can change the size of those photographs or their placement here. Selmira Mangum, former chancellor of Florida A&M. Okay. So for example, I could move Coach Steve Wilson's photograph to the right side from the left just by clicking here. Okay. I can also edit it, okay, if I wanted to. All right, so this little menu pops up and that allows me to manipulate it. All righty, now, it's important that we give attribution for the photographs that we use. So Zoe, pay attention to as much as you can. When that little menu comes up, there's a gear. If we click that and go under properties, it allows us to give an attribution. So we give credit to where we got that photo from, okay? Gear symbol, properties, attribution. year symbol, properties, attribution. Okay. All right. So we can also have, this is being recorded, Zoe also. We can also have quotes, right? So with the plus, we can enter a quote if we would like to, okay? And embed text. Okay, and then finally, we give credits and our sources here at the bottom. All right, so after that, it looks very much like a paper. This particular story map did not have a what do you call it? Video, any video. Let me open one that has video. So this is a story map, and we'll conclude after this, that has video. I don't know why that's not opening, so let's go back to one that will. Let's see. Okay, so this was for a museum exhibit on the football rivalry between A&T and North Carolina Central. Dr. Arwen Smallwood and I worked on with students here. It follows sort of the same format, maps that can help to contextualize where people are. You can show movement on the maps. In other words, Quran, like from where your family started to where they moved to, ultimately to end up where they are. A very useful device. You can actually embed story maps within the story map. Right, and then here you have videos that give reflections, for example, on the football rivalry between A&T and Central. This is former Representative G.K. Butterfield, who was a proud Eagle and served in the NCCU marching band.
G.K. Butterfield, representing North Carolina's 1st Congressional District, and I am a 2-time graduate of North Carolina Central University. I earned my bachelor's degree from NCCU in 1971. Actually, I was in the class of 1969, but was drafted into the Army in 1968, returned to Durham in 1970, graduated in 1971. I then entered the School of Law. You can see it on my golf shirt here. I'm a proud Eagle Law grad, graduated from law school in 1974. You know, the rivalry between NCCU and North Carolina A&T is long-standing.
Okay, so we can add video content as well, meaning like interviews that you do with your elders and so forth, clips from those. You can add a photo of them off to the side or something, you know, to help contextualize in telling the story of your family. All right. Excellent resource for helping us to tell stories more imaginatively and better. And this is not speaking. You can see our dean. It's showing how players were giving each other high fives. There's some of the players and coaches that I interviewed. That's Connie Borkin and Edwin Jones, enjoying telling those stories about the football rivalry, a father and son who competed in the rivalry and so forth. Okay, so you can see though, as a opening, Autumn is biased, Quran, you know, Zach, having this as the opening image where you see people moving, and even though you can't hear them or whatever, it makes you much more curious than if I had just put a photo of a football or something. on the page, right? Because you want to figure out, well, what is she talking about when she's doing that? Our AD, former athletic director, Ingrid Wicker, was a phenomenal woman, what she's doing. And there's Dean Wilson. Okay. All right. If there are thoughts or questions about the story mapping, please contact me. All right. But do so only after you've watched the video 1 or 2 times, the videos, to kind of get a sense of things. Okay. You can always open one and play around and kind of get a feel for things. All right. Questions, thoughts, reactions.
No, sir. Thank you for saying that you would post the video. I was trying to watch as much as I could.
We're glad to. Okay, all right. I'm gonna let you all go. We will not meet nearly this long the next time that we meet. But this was a good opening, very important topics. Good to see you all. Safe
Thank you,
time
sir.
till next time. All right.
Have a
Thank you,
good one.
sir. See you next
All
week.
right. You're welcome.
See you, everybody.
Take care. All right.
Bye
Bye-bye.
bye.